Now, no matter how solid a gaming franchise is, there's always going to be at least one dud along the way. I mean, Resident Evil 6 is undoubtedly the lowest point in Capcom's survival horror series, and it's unmistakable that BioShock 2 didn't exactly come close to matching the original. But as disappointing as these follow-ups potentially were, they weren't actually bad games in their own right. Okay, maybe Resident Evil 6 was pretty rubbish, but the sequels on this list aren't just disappointing, they're abysmal, incomplete, or flat out unplayable, and some of these stinkers are so unsalvageable that they've destroyed their corresponding franchise's reputation or bankrupted the development team. So let's take a look at them. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are the 10 worst video game sequels, and say it with me kids, of all time! Oh, that felt good. Number 10, Mega Man X7. Now, when Mega Man X6 was met with scathing reviews, Capcom was eager to go in a new and bold direction for the next installment. Although the X series always followed the standard 2D platform setup, the developers revised Mega Man X7 into a cel-shaded third-person shooter which blended 2D and 3D together. But because Capcom put so much focus on making X7 different, they forgot to make it, actually good. The weapons are unbalanced, the level design is lazy, the music is forgettable, and the gameplay is tedious. The game also has a pretty nasty habit of skipping dialogue during crucial moments. If a character's dialogue jumps to the next line before the previous line finishes, players can miss vital information, making it difficult to follow instructions or complete objectives. Also, you can't play as Mega Man for the first half of the bloody game, despite him being the title character, so that's just false advertising. Even though the franchise has always been strong in the boss department, the Reploids here in this entry, well, they're uncreative and generic. However, there is one boss who definitely deserves special mention, Flame Hyenard. And because this guy keeps yelling "burn" to the ground for the whole battle, he's often regarded as one of the most annoying bosses in gaming. And although this sounds a bit like a nitpick, with his skipping dialogue, janky animations, and badly programmed fighting pattern, well, it just definitely demonstrates everything that is wrong with this dire sequel. Number 9, Earthworm Jim 3D. After seeing the success of Super Mario 64, many 2D platformers decided to make the jump to 3D, although it turned out that many platformers would struggle with the graphical conversion, and few titles handled the transition worse than Earthworm Jim. Now, Earthworm Jim 3D had such a rocky production that Viz Interactive was certain that it would actually be cancelled. In hindsight, it really should have been. The creators struggled with the graphics throughout development, which resulted in serious issues with the frame rate and animation. As the problems continued to pile up, the developers were pressured to cut a lot of features that appeared in early promotions, which ended up infuriating players. Earthworm Jim 3D may have had the zany humor that fans had come to expect, but that didn't make up for this threequel's appalling gameplay. The camera is so inconsistent that you'd swear that one of Jim's enemies was swinging around it deliberately trying to get you killed. The levels are so barren and charmless that you could easily mistake this game as a work in progress rather than a finished product. After playing Earthworm Jim 3D for just a couple of minutes, you'll understand why the franchise has been in limbo for decades. Number 8, Dino Crisis 3. Now, on the surface, it's easy to see Dino Crisis as Resident Evil but with dinosaurs, but due to the game's effective AI, imaginative puzzles, and focus on strategy, this survival horror title definitely stood out on its own. Rather than churning out more of the same, Dino Crisis 2 focused more on action, tossing every prehistoric monster on land, sea, and air at the player. The sequel also expanded the lore and crafted a surprisingly deep storyline. With only 2 installments under its belt, gamers were certain that Dino Crisis would become a long-standing franchise, but when the third entry was released, the series was rendered extinct almost immediately. Now, at first, you'd assume that Dino Crisis 3 was let down by its absurd premise, because the plot boils down to basically dinosaurs in space. However, the story isn't actually the sole issue, because simply put, DC3 has the worst camera ever. That's not actually an exaggeration either. IGN actually awarded this game with the Worst Camera Ever award, which I didn't even know was a thing. It's so hard to see where the enemies are, you'll often have to resort to firing willy-nilly. So if you were hoping for some tactical gameplay like the previous installments, well, there's nothing like that here. Instead, you just fire in random directions hoping to hit something. Yay! Also, there's barely any variation in the enemies themselves. Even though the developers could have implemented countless types of sauropods or pterosaurs, there are only 3 types of baddies excluding bosses here. Furthermore, the room structures look so familiar, it's very easy to get lost, meaning the player is destined to run around in circles for hours. And doesn't that sound like fun? Number 7. Duke Nukem Forever. Considering Duke Nukem Forever took twice as long to develop as Breath of the Wild, gamers safely assumed this long-awaited sequel just couldn't live up to the hype. And since the gaming community was ready to accept disappointment, you think this would actually take the sting out when they finally got their hands on Duke Nukem Forever. But against all odds, this heavily delayed shooter was actually far worse than anyone could have imagined. Despite a 14-year production, Duke Nukem Forever doesn't feel like a single game. Because the gameplay and level design varies so drastically, it's as if the developers scrapped the project 5 or 6 times before ultimately deciding to mesh all of their work together into a mismatched mess. What's worse is that there isn't a single quality that justifies the lengthy production. Ironically, the game feels rushed due to the uninspired graphics, janky frame rate, basic levels, and unresponsive controls. And these flaws feel more apparent since Duke Nukem Forever can't go 5 minutes without putting down vastly superior titles like Halo and calling them crap. This sequel has so little to offer, you wonder why the team dedicated over a decade of their life to see the project to the bitter and rather underwhelming end. Number 6. Clay Fighter 63 1/3. Back in 1993, Clay Fighter won gamers over with its claymation-style graphics and parody-like characters. The fighting mechanics weren't exactly anything special, but the first 2 installments were charming enough to stand out against competitors. I mean, how can you not laugh watching an Elvis impersonator fighting sentient taffy? Sadly, with Clay Fighter 63 1/3, that creativity from its predecessors was nowhere to be seen. The AI is lazy, the animation is choppy, the gags are tiresome, and the combos are frustrating to pull off. To the sequel's credit, it does boast some astoundingly talented voice actors, including Dan Castellaneta, Rob Paulson, and Frank Welker, but because of the fuzzy sound, these performers' talents are utterly wasted. Interplay Productions attempted to restore the Clay Fighter name by bringing out an updated version called Clay Fighter 63 1/3 The Sculptor's Cut, but since this revision made no attempt to fix the original's glaring problems, you wonder why they even bothered. The Sculptor's Cut sold so abysmally, it became one of the rarest N64 games ever, and is heavily desired by collectors. So there you have it, Clay Fighter 63 1/3 became a collectible purely because it absolutely sucked. Number 5. Sonic the Hedgehog 2006. Sonic the Hedgehog 2006 is so infamous that most gamers are aware of how awful it truly is, even if they've never played it. If you are among these lucky few who've never experienced this travesty, then you might think that it can't be as bad as everyone says. But because it contains so many bugs, so much awful dialogue, and so many cringeworthy scenes, you may assume that it falls into the so bad it's good territory. But let's not forget about the game's biggest problem. No, it's not the awkward romance, the incessant crashes, or the actors flubbing their lines. The worst thing about Sonic 06 is the bloody loading times. If you speak to any character at all in this game, the conversation needs about 30 seconds to load every single time. Imagine if you had to watch a loading screen every time you spoke to an NPC in Skyrim, Grand Theft Auto, Breath of the Wild. It would completely destroy the flow of this game, right? Now, it may sound harsh, but problems like this prove that Sonic 06 deserved all the hate it received. In fact, Sega was so disappointed by how things turned out, they delisted Sonic 06 from retailers, hoping to protect the franchise's reputation. And you just know that a game is bad when the creators themselves are trying to stop the public from buying it. Number 4. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5. Now, at first you'd expect a skateboarding game to be a rather niche market, no matter how good it is, but Tony Hawk's Pro Skater became a juggernaut in the gaming world thanks to its balanced learning curve, accessible controls, seamless physics, and a flawless soundtrack. Although the barrage of sequels could have saturated the original's legacy, the follow-ups definitely maintained the first game's high standard. But when Activision realized that their licensing deal with Tony Hawk was set to expire in 2015, they had Robo-Modo rush out one last title. To hit the Pro Skater 5's deadline, the developers only had a few months to cobble something together, causing one of the most rushed productions in gaming history. To the surprise of no one, the finished product was, well, rather unfinished, due to the lazy aesthetics, unresponsive NPCs, unpleasant unplayable online mode, relentless glitches, and limited modes, there just wasn't enough to satisfy anybody. Pro Skater 5 was unanimously declared the worst game of 2015, and Robomodo went out of business within a year. Considering there hasn't been a new mainline installment since, it looks like Pro Skater 5 single-handedly destroyed this once beloved franchise. But here's hoping that the well-received recent remakes will change things. Number 3. Far Cry Vengeance. Shortly after the release of Far Cry Instinct's Evolution, the developers collaborated with Nintendo to remake the game for the Wii. Not only was this version tailored for the console's motion controls, it had a few extra vehicles, weapons, and levels. And on the surface, this reboot, retitled as Far Cry Vengeance, should have been superior to the original in every single way. Unfortunately, Vengeance was an unmitigated disaster. The textures were low-res, the controls were surprisingly poor, and the dialogue was woefully cheesy. Objects like rocks and trees appeared out of thin air so often that you'd think that it was an intentional feature. The graphics were so dated, they didn't even look last gen, they looked last gen. Seriously, how does the original look better than the remaster? But worst of all, Vengeance might have the worst enemy AI in gaming history. Baddies just don't bat an eyelid when you walk right up to them, and you don't have to worry about when they finally shoot at you since they have the marksmanship skills of a stormtrooper with cataracts. Although Far Cry has occasionally dropped the ball, there is no question that Vengeance is the nadir of that franchise. Number 2. Steel Battalion Heavy Armor. If you're going to make a game that focuses on reading the player's body movements, the most integral part of development of that game is to make sure that the game can bloody read the player movements, right? Now, even though the Kinect's imprecision has become a bit of a running joke, no game demonstrates this flawed peripheral better than Steel Battalion Heavy Armor. Despite the stellar graphics, story, and character development, the dysfunctional controls make your entire playthrough of this game incessantly agonizing. While playing any game with motion controls, you expect there to be a bit of imprecision. But when Heavy Armor misreads the most innocuous gesture as a command to launch a missile strike, you realize very quickly how unplayable this is. The controls are so broken that it almost feels like the game is trolling you. The Kinect will sometimes detect that you're moving frantically even when you're not even moving at all. On the other hand, your character might not move a muscle despite the fact that you're waving your hands around frantically. Although From Software and Capcom put a lot of work into Steel Battalion Heavy Armor, the limitations of this Kinect game make this title feel like an absolute chore. And number 1, Bomberman Act 0. Bomberman Act 0 perfectly exemplifies the mantra, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Even though Hudson Soft's highly addictive series was renowned for its adorable aesthetic, the developers decided to set Bomberman Act 0 in a dystopian world, giving everything a grimy, hyper-realistic design. This new look is so far removed from the source material that you'd assume that Act 0 is a rip-off and not a continuation of the Bomberman series. Being the devil's advocate, Act 0 could have got away with this gritty look if the gameplay was up to par. After all, it was the awesome level design and creative power-ups that defined the original series. Sadly, this reboot couldn't get anything right. The collision detection is dreadful, the AI is unbalanced, the loading times are unbearable, and the music is just awful. Also, every level is actually the same, and I don't mean that they're similar, I mean that all the arenas are identical. And because there's no variety in matches, there's nothing to motivate you. Although you have to commend Hudson Soft for at least trying something different, it's easy to see why Bomberman Act 0 is often hailed as the worst video game sequel, and say it with me kids, of all time. And there we go, my friends, those were the 10 worst video game sequels of all time. I hope that you enjoyed that, and please let me know what you thought about it down in the comments section below. As always, I've been Jules, and you can go follow me over on Instagram at RetroJ, but the O is a 0. Hope to see you over there. And you can go check out all my Warhammer miniatures that I'm painting up at the moment. But before I go, I just want to say one thing. Hope you're treating yourself well with love and respect, my friend. At the time of recording, it is the beginning of the year of 2023. And I know that we've got a lot of goals and aspirations in mind as we try and march on into this uncertain future. But just remember, above all else, while it is very key to try and achieve your goals to be the best that you can be, remember to give yourself a bit of a break every once in a while, alright? Don't push yourself too hard too quickly out of the gate. Because I want you to get through to the end of this year looking back at it and saying, I achieved something, rather than I felt like I burned out straight away. So treat yourself with love, my friend, because you bloody well deserve it. As always, I've been Jules. You have been awesome. Never forget that, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye.